Thank you, Laura, for just the great effort that Texas A&M AgriLife does with their program. I know she asked how many of you have utilized their simulators and all, and about 50% had. The other 50%, you're missing out on something. You need to contact them and participate in the program because it's a phenomenal tool to use in your education and outreach efforts. All right, our next speaker is John Ulczycki. He comes to us from the National Safety Council, where he has a wide range of responsibilities and oversees numerous safety initiatives. And perhaps no other organization understands the importance of collaboration and partnerships more than the National Safety Council. They're a 100-year-old nonprofit organization that works with more than 50,000 member companies and government agencies, community organizations, and the general public to promote safety. John is Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the National Safety Council. He is involved with communications and has been in communications and public affairs for 20 years before joining the National Safety Council, and he has a deep understanding of the issue of impaired driving. And we're also pleased to be partnering with the National Safety Council doing a Texas Employer Initiative, which is a phenomenal program and also another great resource for all of us available. So, John?
Good afternoon, everyone. The good news is I'm the last speaker. The even better news is no more PowerPoints. We've heard some great strategies today, and I want to kind of bring to a head a couple of ideas and a couple of concepts, and maybe in a way you haven't thought of them before. First, I have to tell you, for all the law enforcement folks in the room, different people have different versions of what the 4 E's mean. Engineering, education, enforcement, EMS. I have my own definition of the 4 E's. It's enforcement, and education about enforcement. Because as we all know, high visibility enforcement is what's really effective. You all explained that much more eloquently than I ever could, so I'm not going to talk about enforcement, even though I just want you to know it's very near and dear to everything that is done in impaired driving, distracted driving, and pretty much every area of traffic safety. What I want to talk about is a couple of concepts: collaboration and what I would call influence. We can talk about enforcement, but unfortunately there's a culture of people, and we have to get inside that culture and understand why this culture of some people don't obey laws, don't pay attention to enforcement. Increasingly at the National Safety Council, we look at these issues and we look at how can we use influence to change behavior separate and apart from laws and regulations. Let me give you a couple of examples. We're working with chief executive officers of major corporations to influence other CEOs to pass total cell phone bans in their companies. How many of you work for a company or an organization where you can't use the phone handheld or hands-free while driving on company business? Wow, that's pretty good. It's maybe 10%, 15% of the room. 5 years ago, it would have been 1%. There'd have been one hand in the back. We're making progress. We've got a long way to go. This isn't about distracted driving, but if you don't have a total cell phone ban policy in your organization, the simple question is, why not? And if it takes a CEO, usually, to enact those policies, we can help you with that. Secondly, we work with parents to influence other parents about how to better practice with their teen drivers. Those of us who have educated teens how to drive probably know that challenge pretty well. We know that in some parts of the country we don't have adequate, sufficient resources for driver education, and the onus is on parents, but a lot of parents don't know how to do that. So we have a program called Drive at Home. You can go driveathome.org, find out more about parents and how parents can better teach their teens. We have teen coalitions across the state of Texas. A teen coalition that brings together educators, teenagers, parents, law enforcement on the subject of teen driving, and work with teens to influence other teens. And we've got projects going on around the state right now. Another example is how teens in many high schools influence other teens to wear seatbelts and to not use alcohol or drugs. But sometimes when we hear about these teen influences and other kinds of peer influence programs, we don't really think about ourselves, do we? We don't really think about adults influencing other adults. And I would tell you that it is a very powerful factor, particularly when you think about the population that is most likely to drink and drive. As we saw this morning from the statistics, young adults are overrepresented in drinking and driving crashes. They're certainly not the only population that's drinking and driving. It happens across the entire spectrum. But I can tell you that that is a key issue. And one of the things that we do, Terry just mentioned it, is work through our program with employers to give employers tools to give to their employees, their workers, in many cases these young adults, who are engaged in these activities. And Lisa Robinson is our program manager. Lisa, will you stand up? Lisa runs our Driving Concern program partnership with TxDOT. If your organization is not receiving communications from us, see Lisa or give me your card or give Lisa her card. We'll be happy to add you. It's in partnership with TxDOT, where we give materials to employers to share, to influence their employees. The latest topic is about tailgating. Tailgating at football games, a popular and very dangerous source of drunk driving. And we have seen some data that indicates that when employees receive these messages from their employers, that they maybe take it a little more to heart than when they hear it from or read it in the newspaper, if they even read the newspaper. So each of you works for an organization that employs people, and your organization can take action, and I would encourage you to look at how you can influence the people in your organization and the people in your community. Let's talk about peer influence. I see some young adults in this room, people under, let's say, under the age of 35. How do you influence other people in your group? For those of us older than that, how do we influence others? What are the things that we do to influence drinking and driving in our own social groups? You know, when we develop strategies for any group, I mentioned the strategies around CEOs and parents and teens, we talk to them. So how many of you have talked to people who drink and drive? How many of you have actually gone into bars and restaurants and asked people what it would take for them to never drink and drive? Now, I'm lucky. I actually have my own focus group. I've got 6 kids in their 20s. Hey, I am just fortunate that I got through the teen years with only a few crashes, none serious, and 1 spout of red painted hair. That's pretty good. I know that unfortunately a lot of parents aren't so lucky. But I ask my own kids, what would it take? And I never say you, because I never want to think that they're actually doing it, but what would it take for your friends or those you know to never drink and drive? And it was interesting. They told me about some social media sites I had never heard of, told me about how they talk about things, how they order taxis and cabs and things like Uber and Lyft and other kinds of methodologies that I have never used personally, don't know much about. But they also told me something else, which is really, I think, important. Is that sometimes we need more than education and media. We actually needed intervention. And that sometimes they themselves have had to do an intervention, pull the keys away from a friend, or call a cab for a friend, or make sure that the friend never actually got in the car. And they, I think, some of them in particular, influence their other friends to not do that. But I don't know how widespread that is among the, what I would call the most at-risk group. But I would suggest to you in your community, it would be worth asking those questions. Talk to young adults and find out what would it take in your community for them and their friends to never drink and drive. You might be, some of you might say, well, I'm not sure that I'm going to learn anything. Why don't you try it and see? You might learn, for example, that the reason they don't have a designated driver or don't practice designated driver is because in your community, the designated driver means the person who only had 4 drinks. Doesn't really work very well if that's how they look at it. So what would it take in that kind of a social culture to understand how to use some other intervention rather than, say, keep telling them about designated driver when it's effectively meaningless. Or what if you live in a community where there is no cab service? So the idea of calling a cab is hardly valuable in a community where there's no cab to call. And so as public health and safety people, we might advocate strategies that fall on deaf ears and are irrelevant to people depending on where they live. And sometimes you might live in a community like that and realize, you know what? We need to step up and do something ourselves about it. So one example, for example, is Dylan's Drivers from Lamar County, Texas and Paris. Anybody here from Paris or that area? Way up north. So have you heard of Dylan's Drivers? So in 2011, a drunk driving tragedy took the life of Dylan Ballard, who was a passenger in a vehicle driven by someone who's impaired. And that group was formed to recognize his death, and they provide rides to people who are incapable or lack access to a cab. They provide vouchers. They actually provide, not just provide vouchers, they provide trained drivers to take people home. And if you live in a community where designated driver or take a cab is meaningless, you might want to think about what you need to do to work with folks in your community to build something like they have done in Paris, Texas, where they've given 4,700 rides to people in less than 2 years. Another approach that's proven to work is what we might call a social norms approach. Now, let me give you an example of a social norms. We think a lot about what I would call fear-based messaging around enforcement. Social norms is a little different. Social norms addresses the concept that people may not actually be drinking and driving as much as certain members of the population might think. For example, surveys on college campuses show that 4 out of 5 kids actually drink very little. Yet the perception is that a lot of kids drink a lot. And in fact, when kids do drink, they are often in situations where they see a lot of people drinking a lot, and they think that is the social norm for that campus. So a social norms campaign actually on college campuses has focused on the fact that they educate the kids. 4 out of 5 kids on this campus do not drink more than 3 drinks a week. That gives an entirely different frame of reference to kids. They've actually done it with young adults in the state of Montana, where they took one third of the state and educated 1/3 of the state in social norms messaging, saying 4 out of 5 young adults in Montana do not drive drunk. And then on the other, in the middle of the state, they did nothing, and on the other end of the state, where they got none of this messaging, they measured the difference. And there was a significant difference in a reduction in drunk driving. So there are alternatives to the regular, what I would call fear-based messaging, enforcement-based messaging, that play to the fact of proper perception of what the social norm is. Now, when we think about social norms, think about your own social norms. And think about how you can influence in your own family, in your own groups, and among your friends, your colleagues, your work friends, and your community. So let me give you a couple examples. When you have a barbecue at your house, do you serve alcohol? If you do you cut it off at a certain time? And if you do all that, do you still offer rides home to people? Now, I would suggest that in many parts of Texas, but indeed not just Texas, but in every country, every state, people don't do that. That's not a social norm. Should it be? You all are dedicated to alcohol prevention. Would we do that? I happen to do that at my family barbecues, and my brothers-in-law aren't real happy with me sometimes because they say, you know what, come on, treat me as an adult. I can handle it. I'm sorry you had 3 beers today. I'm not taking the chance. I'm sure you can handle it. You've probably handled it 100 times in your life. Humor me. I'm taking you home. It's a social norm. They now know, in fact, they now know when they come to my house, they're probably not going to be drinking very much, and if they do, they know they're not going to drive home. It's a social norm in my family that I've started. Does my Do my kids like it? Not really. Of course, my kids also said, when I asked them to stop texting during family dinners, they said, okay, but just know we're going to probably do it when we drive home. They were kidding, I think. Well, you have to understand, when your father's a safety geek, they find ways to needle you, right? I also tell you that we think about collaboration. Community collaborations are really important. And I'm going to give you a model. We have a model called Safe Communities that we have, Safe Communities in Dallas and Fort Worth, that bring together key people from a community. But think about where you live, in your own community. You don't have to live in a safe community to understand the concept. So you and about 100 other people at least in your community care about impaired driving. Do you know who they are? Have you ever talked to them? Have you ever talked to the CEO of the hospital, the public health leader of your local hospital? Have you ever talked to the police chief? Have you ever talked to the principal of your high school? Have you ever talked to the leading employers in town who employ people? That's what we do in Safe Communities. We collaborate, we bring all those folks together to say, what can we do about all of the injury prevention issues in their community? And it's amazing when you bring that kind of power in one room, what you end up finding out. It is amazing how many police chiefs have never met the principal and how many CEOs of the local or principals of the local high school have never met the employers that employ the parents of the kids going to the high school. And there are a lot of common strategies that can be developed when you bring those various pieces together. And what can you do when you bring them together? What can you do as an active community to collaborate? Well, first, I want to echo the comments made this morning by Carl McDonald of MAD. I'm going to give you a couple specific things you can do, because he hit on a couple of really important things you can do. Number one thing you can do is, to the extent, I know some of you work in positions where you can't lobby and you can't advocate and you can't stand up for laws. I get that, but some of you can. Number one, advocate for laws in Austin to require ignition interlocks for all first-time offenders. As Carl said this morning, it's proven to work. We know it works in all the states where it's been tried. In Texas, an interlock is mandatory only as a condition of suspending the jail sentence for a high BAC or a repeat violator. But it's not mandatory for all DWI offenders, so they're free to reoffend. States that have passed laws are seeing reductions in crash fatalities involving repeat violators by 36 to 46%. You showed some numbers, 60 to 90%. Of rearrest rates. That's one law that we know is proven to work, and community coalitions working with your legislators can get it done. And I spent a lot of time in Austin working on issues like this: teen driving, prescription drug abuse, impaired driving. Community coalitions are powerful in making that happen. The second thing is you and your community group can advocate for is something that Nicole mentioned a little while ago: compliance checks. When retailers know they're being watched about providing sales to underage, to minors, they pay attention. When community groups say that we care and we're your customers, but we want to make sure and we ask that you not serve everyone, they know that your community groups care, they tend to care. There's another one. Those of you who are working, who have kids in high school. So when I drove by my high school, and there are other high schools that I drive by in my day, I see big signs. And they say, when parents host, parents lose. Talking about social host campaigns. And I've heard a lot of questions. What does that mean? Well, it means if you host a party where alcohol is served, you probably, in the state in which I live, not Texas, you probably will go to jail. And in fact, there have been parents who have gone to prison in Illinois for hosting a party in which alcohol was served because it led to a fatality. I think there's a A lot of things you can do by bringing folks together in your community. I encourage you to collaborate. I encourage you to think about how you and all of us can influence the people that we touch in our own lives. And hopefully this day has given you some ideas that you can take back with you to influence and collaborate with others to not just reduce drunk driving, but to eliminate it. And now the good news. Your last speech is over. Thanks very much.